Upon her return to Washington, D.C., Mrs. Kennedy informed her husband, the president, about the message, and again what exactly was said remains a secret. However, immediately after talking with his wife, and in the months to follow, President Kennedy began making sweeping changes to the entire structure of the United States government by issuing a stream of executive decisions, to include in 1962 10,997, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of the Interior, 10,998, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of Agriculture, 10,999, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of Commerce, 11,000, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of Labor, 11,001, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare, 11,002, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Postmaster General, 11,003, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Agency, 11,004, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Housing and Home Finance Administrator, 11,005, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1963, 11,087, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of State, 11,088, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Secretary of the Treasury, 11,089, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Atomic Energy Commission, 11,090, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Civil Aeronautics Board, 11,091, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Civil Service Commission, 11,092, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Federal Communications Commission, 11,093, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Administrator of General Services, 11,094, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, the Farm Credit Administration, the Export-Import Bank of Washington, the Board of Directors of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Administrator of the Small Business Administration, the Administrator of Veterans Affairs, 11,095, assigning emergency preparedness functions to the Board of Directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Railroad Retirement Board, the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the Federal Power Commission, the Director of the National Science Foundation. And aside from these vast and sweeping reforms to the government, President Kennedy also issued Federal Reserve and Executive Order 11,110, which could be one of the very reasons he was killed. Executive Order 11,110, Amendment of Executive Order No. 10289 as amended, relating to the performance of certain functions affecting the Department of the Treasury by virtue of the authority vested in me by Section 301 of Title III of the United States Code. It is ordered as follows. Section 1. Executive Order No. 10289 of September 19, 1951, as amended, is hereby further amended by adding at the end of paragraph 1 thereof the following subparagraph JJ, the authority vested in the President by paragraph B of Section 43 of the Act of May 12, 1933, as amended 31 U.S.C. 821b, to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury not then held for redemption of any outstanding silver certificates, to prescribe the denomination of such silver certificates, and to coin standard silver dollars and subsidiary silver currency for their redemption, and b. by revoking subparagraphs B and C of paragraph 2 thereof. Sec. 2. The amendments made by this order shall not affect any act done, or any right accruing or accrued, or any suit or proceeding had or commenced in any civil or criminal cause prior to the date of this order, but all such liabilities shall continue and may be in force as if said amendments had not been made. John F. Kennedy, The White House, June 4, 1963. On June 4, 1963, President Kennedy made his attempt to strip the Federal Reserve Bank of its power to loan money to the government at interest. On the day President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order No. 11110, that returned to the U.S. government the power to issue currency, without going through the Federal Reserve, President Kennedy's order gave the Treasury the power to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. This meant that for every ounce of silver in the U.S. Treasury's vault, the government could introduce new money into circulation. In all, President Kennedy brought nearly $4.3 billion in U.S. notes into circulation. The ramifications of this bill were enormous. With the stroke of a pen, President Kennedy was on his way to putting the Federal Reserve Bank of New York out of business. If enough of these silver certificates were to come into circulation, they would have eliminated the demand for Federal Reserve notes. This is because the silver certificates are backed by silver, and the Federal Reserve notes are not backed by anything. Executive Order 11,110 could have prevented the national debt from reaching its current level, because it would have given the government the ability to repay its debt without going to the Federal Reserve, and being charged interest in order to create the new money. Executive Order 11,110 gave the U.S. the ability to create its own money backed by silver. After President Kennedy was assassinated just 5 months later, no more silver certificates were issued. This executive order was never repealed by any U.S. president through an executive order, and is still valid. Why then has no president utilized it? Virtually all of the nearly $6 trillion in debt has been created since 1963, and if a U.S. president had utilized Executive Order 11,110, the debt would be nowhere near the current level. Perhaps the assassination of JFK was a warning to future presidents, who would think to eliminate the U.S. debt by eliminating the Federal Reserve's control over the creation of money. Mr. Kennedy challenged the government of money by challenging the two most successful vehicles that have been used to drive up debt, war and the creation of money by privately owned central bank. As America's debt reaches unbearable levels and a conflict continues in Iraq that will further increase America's debt, one is forced to ask, will President Bush utilize Executive Order 11,110 and, if so, is he willing to pay the ultimate price for doing so? Or is something else going on? Well, with the sweeping changes President Kennedy made to the federal government, and its new organizational structure made to ensure the continuation of the government in the event of any emergency, President Kennedy also put into play a very powerful ticking time bomb, so to speak, right in the vaults of the Federal Reserve banking system. You must remember here that the Federal Reserve banking system is a private bank, and is not owned by the United States, its government or its citizens.